Okay, welcome everybody to the second panel session for today. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and are ready to go. We have an esteemed panel I'll introduce in just a moment. But I guess I would like to say to start off with that we're here to learn and share about lots of different aspects of indoor air quality over the next few days, but we're also here to celebrate this fantastic report that Wendy has led on the state of indoor air in Australia. And now we're going to talk a bit more about the practice side of this. This is certainly a landmark document, I think, in our journey towards clean air, and really provides a foundation on which we can build, because it sets out the challenges. It not only looks at the data, but also sets out the challenges for the different stakeholders, including regulators, facilities managers, and public health experts. There are a few things that struck me about the document when I read it that I'd just like to share before we start. First was something that Anna Maria also pointed out, which was the lack of data. We certainly need more data, and as I'll discuss tomorrow, we often concentrate on how bad everything is, assume everything's really bad, but there's some good examples as well. We just don't really have a good idea of the state of indoor air in terms of data, I think the report points out. And this is really important because, as Brendan alluded to earlier, do we need every building to be improved, or is there a subset or selection we should target? We just don't know until we have more data. There's actually a lot of data out there, but perhaps it hasn't made its way into the literature. Perhaps there's building managers that have a lot of data, engineering, building services that have a lot of data. So how can we get together to get this data published is an important question we have to ask. Another aspect that's relevant to this group that we've got here this afternoon is the huge variation of uses and occupancy densities and types of spaces within each of the categories that are in this report. And this presents special challenges if the goal is safe air everywhere, and we'll discuss this shortly. So I should have introduced myself. Sorry, I'm Jason Monti. I'm a professor of fluid dynamics and the head of School of Electrical, Mechanical and Infrastructure Engineering at the University of Melbourne. And I'd like to introduce you to our panel. We have Simon Witts, who's a building services engineer. He introduced himself before. He designs all aspects of buildings, including ventilation systems, and often described by Lydia as a magician for his ability to tell us where the air is going in a room. We have Geoff Hanmer, I hope. We have Geoff online, yep. Geoff is the architect and leader in design for indoor air quality, with particular interest in, or has written a lot about education settings. Liam O'Brien, who's going to be our first speaker in just a moment, who's the ACTU Assistant Secretary and Advocate for Workers' Rights, and is well known to many of us. It's spoken many times about the health and safety of workers in relation to indoor air. And finally, Nick Burt is the CEO of Facilities Managers Australia. And if anyone has tried to investigate or intervene in indoor air quality in buildings, you would know that the facilities manager is probably the most important person to your goal. And Nick represents that community who are critical in the goal, as I said. So I'm going to invite Liam to speak first to us.
All right, while we're getting that going, because I'm not a scientist in the room. Yeah, oh, there we go. Good. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jason, for the introduction, but also for the opportunity to be here. As you said before, I know I've spoken to a lot of people in this room before, and I am a passionate advocate for workers' rights. And I want to cover off on a few things today. Before I do, I want to start by acknowledging country. We're here in cooler Melbourne, since it was warm over the weekend for those that managed to get here over the weekend, but I want to acknowledge we're here on Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. But I also want to congratulate you all on the report, because I think, and we're going to talk about how this applies in a work health and safety context in a moment, it provides a great roadmap for the challenge that's ahead of us in terms of working towards indoor air quality that is safe for all. So I want to cover off on a few things today. I want to talk about health and safety as a right. I think we often think about health and safety as a set of rules that make sure that we stay safe at work, but I want to maybe implore upon everybody here that it's actually fundamentally it's a rights-based framework, and it's important to think about it not just in the context of a right to a healthy and safe working environment, but actually in the context of a right to health. And there are four sort of key areas I want to touch on. I want to talk a little bit about our health and safety framework and why I think this is a really crucial framework to delivering on improved indoor air quality. I want to talk a bit about air quality as a determinant of our health. And we don't think about this enough when we think about work health and safety. I'm about to tip the lectern over on people. do no harm's my first starting point when it comes to health and safety. But I do want to talk about air because I think air gets not nearly enough attention when it comes to its impact on workers' health in particular. And I also want to talk about some of the union wins, some of the ways in which our movement has really been campaigning over the last 5 years around air quality, and link that to the next frontier in the report that we've got at the moment. So I suppose moving right along, and I sort of jumped ahead a little bit before to talk about health and safety as a rights-based framework, but I don't think people quite appreciate the right to a healthy and safe working environment is a fundamental human right. 3 years ago, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, the UN agency that's responsible for workers' rights, in fact, the oldest UN agency, predates the UN, predates the League of Nations. It is something that was set up as the Treaty of Versailles. It's something we're very proud of and has endured through world wars. It has 4 fundamental rights, one of which is the right to a safe and healthy working environment. And so health and safety now sits alongside issues like the right to join and bargain within your union, the right to be free from forced labour, elimination of child labour, but also the right to be free from discrimination. And so health and safety is a pretty important right. And as an Australian, we should be very proud that Australia was the first country in the region and the second globally to ratify all of those fundamental rights. And so, again, if we think about health and safety, it is really important in a global context and something that Australia has led the way on. But a rights-based framework is really underpinned by a couple of other rights that's really critical to how we achieve health and safety at work. The right to organise and to be represented in the workplace, the right to cease unsafe work, to remove yourself from situations in the workplace that are hazardous to your health, the right to be consulted, to have agency in your workplace, to understand the risks that you're exposed to, the right to be trained. And we think about the right to things like monitoring and data. It's the right to know about the things that are likely to cause harm to your health at the workplace. But as I said, they're protected internationally by the ILO conventions, particularly 2 conventions, 155 and 187, but they're also enshrined in our work health and safety framework. Whilst we're here in Victoria, which is not a harmonised work health and safety state, as the former Premier will know, Victoria was used as the model for the national work health and safety laws. So Victoria, like the rest of the country, codifies many of these rights when it comes to our framework. So I said before I want to talk a little bit about air quality, but before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about deaths at work, because I talk about the right to a healthy and safe working environment, but unfortunately for many, the right that every year isn't realised. And for every year, about 200 workers are killed in workplaces. So those are incidents, might be a fall from heights, might be hit by a moving object, might be hit by a motor vehicle. What I don't think people realise is that when we think about the impact that poor air has when it comes to fatalities at work, it's an order of magnitude about 25 times greater, and that is just 2 exposures, asbestos and silica. So just from those 2 exposures, air quality has a much more significant impact on our health, but does not get anywhere near the attention that we think it deserves. And something that we're hopeful that when we think about the context of poor air quality can really help us move into the indoor air discussion. As we know, there's been a pretty significant campaign over the last few years in relation to one of those exposures. Obviously, asbestos, well known. Australia has some of the highest burden of asbestos-related disease in the world per capita. We also, unfortunately, have a really significant instance of silicosis. And whilst asbestos largely affects an older population due to the long latency period of asbestos-related disease, silicosis is increasingly getting to younger workers. And so this was Anthony White, who was one of the first recently diagnosed cases out of engineered stone, worked in the industry for 10 years. He was 36 years old when he died in 2019. He and his brother both had silicosis, and 1 in 4 stonemasons, as of 2 years ago, were diagnosed with silicosis. So air is a really significant issue for our movement. It is something that we have long campaigned for, whether it be in relation to dusts, chemicals, or indeed, as we're about to talk about, indoor air quality more broadly. So there's been a lot of movement when it comes to changes around air quality, many of them long overdue. I mentioned before that 2 years ago, we achieved a massive world-first outcome in banning engineered stone, and an item that is a fashion item that, as I said, 1 in 4 stonemasons that were working with it had been diagnosed with silicosis. And so we've got a world-first ban on engineered stone, we've got a world-first regulation in relation to silica as well, and we will will very soon drop to the lowest exposure standard anywhere in the world in relation to silica, but actually over 700 chemicals, which we've recently reviewed and reduced down about 70 of them to now having what we would describe as health-based protective standards. And so there's been a lot of work in recent years around air. These are largely pollutants that are generated from the work. But I think indoor air is the next frontier that we'll come to. Done a lot of work, I'm doing a lot of work on lead. There's a lot of work happening in relation to lead. And as I said before, asbestos, which still claims 4,000 people every year, despite the fact that we banned it 20 years ago, is about to see a significant review of that framework because we still have 6 million tonnes of asbestos left in the built environment. Nearly all of it is there well past its use-by date. It is most likely to be degrading and is likely to degrade even further in the generations to come. And recent modelling says that if we continue to remove at the very slow rate of asbestos, we're going to see an excess death rate of about 30,000 people over the course of the next century. So there's real value in improving indoor air quality. It's real value in terms of removing the things that harm us. The one other area that we're nearly about to conclude is the biohazards code of practice, which again also has been long overdue, something that we urged during the pandemic we needed to have. It was a clear gap in our health and safety framework in relation to biological hazards. It would have been fantastic if we had had it during the pandemic because it would have provided real practical guidance to workplaces about how to manage COVID, but something that we think is long overdue. And so these are just some of the areas where our movement has been really focused about how do we fix the work health and safety framework up when it comes to improving air quality and improving the rights that workers have. And the next thing I want to talk about is actually I personally want to pay credit to a colleague, Alison, who shared this lovely bit of data with me. But it starts to show that actually we think about the challenge post-COVID, post-pandemic that we've got in workplaces. This was something that really stepped out and sort of slapped me in the face because I keep thinking as a movement, we're campaigning right now for a 4-day week, we're campaigning for extra weeks leave. Nobody's sitting there saying, well, why am I not increasing my sick leave balances? Because right now that shows a pretty significant increase in the use of sick leave in a world where I would argue things like working from home probably see more people work and perform work whilst unwell. But there's a lot of factors here that I think are coming into a reason why we need to do much more when it comes to prevention. We know we've seen an increase in respiratory illnesses since the pandemic. It's got a significant impact when it comes to equity. We know that there are many workers who are immune suppressed that do have issues in terms of accessing workplaces, in particular those that are poorly ventilated. And this is exacerbating a lot of workforce shortages. You know, if we think about just the care sector, which is massively growing, huge issues in terms of workforce shortages that improving indoor air quality could really help us work towards. So I want to come to the last slide that I want to talk about, which is really the opportunity that's before us. And again, coming back to our work health and safety framework, there's some opportunities we think there are to make changes that will strengthen the rights for workers to demand better indoor air quality. So as we know, a duty on employers to ensure the health and safety of workers and others in the workplace so far as is reasonably practicable. It's a dynamic system. It's one that requires risk assessments in every location. It's not simply set a measure and you can leave it. You've got to do risk assessments. You've got to involve workers. You've got to discuss the ways in which you're controlling them. It's agnostic to hazards. So yes, we regulate a number of hazards because we have proven ways of controlling those risks, and we should do so in the same way when it comes to air. But actually, the health and safety duty is so broad. It requires the consideration of all risks in the workplace, including airborne contaminants like biological hazards. It also, as I said before, has broad regulations that specifically call out different risk areas for us to consider. There is a regulation, for example, on ventilation that says that work has to be, the ventilation has to be safe to allow work to be conducted, but it does not prescribe any level of detail about what safe is. So we think there's a real opportunity for us to address this. And then there's a final area, which is work that we've already commenced, is a review of our code of practice when it comes to managing the working environment facilities. So practical guidance that we can give to employers, to facility managers about what is considered safe indoor air. What are the control measures that we should be requiring workplaces to do? So I suppose in summing up, I really want to preach to many respects, the converted, that the health and safety framework provides a really impactful way in which, with a few changes, we can have really significant impact when it comes to indoor air quality. It's fundamentally a rights-based framework, which I think is critical when we think about ensuring indoor air quality, because it comes down to workers and their representatives be able to agitate in workplaces for safer air. So I might leave it there, Jason. I'm not sure we're going to do questions now or after, but perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Liam. Just before we go to Nicholas, I was given this note that somebody's left their light on. It's Subaru SUV. I think it's 1MS6UA, 1MS6UA. So if that's you, you might want to turn the light off. And I apologise if 15 minutes made the difference there, because I was supposed to say that at the start of this session. So hopefully you're safe still. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Nick Burt now.
Thank you, Jason. And Liam, I like that line, sort of talking to people who are already on the journey. And I think someone said to me once, the reason that you speak to the choir and so that you can get them all to sing the same. And so I think that's one of the hallmarks of what we do up here. Today, I just wanted to take you through some of my observations of the report and maybe perhaps try and hook that back to some of the practical things which are happening across the facilities management space and see if we can't come to a conclusion which is less grim and recognises the challenges but also the opportunities that might fall out the other side. So just in terms of the report itself, I think one of the things which struck me about the report when I read through it was the opportunity that it provided to look at the breadth of the built environment. There's very few areas of policy in the built environment where things aren't taken by a building class by class, as opposed to the entire suite of the built environment various building classes. And so I think it was a great report from that breadth perspective, but also it gave a lot of detail across a period of time rather than just a point in time, which I thought was great. And I haven't seen that type of information consolidated in that way previously. And I think in terms of this report, it then provides the opportunity for enabling many things. While I think it demonstrates the additional research that is required, building class by building class, it does interrogate interventions at that same level and treat each of those classes independently. And this is particularly useful when you're talking about the different types of facilities that our members would manage on a day-to-day basis. Understanding the interventions that are required and making sure that the issues of indoor air are being brought to the front of mind is particularly important in the mind of a facilities manager who has everything from making sure that the building is safe, making sure that the air quality's of good and supports well-being in the space. Right through to the other physical infrastructure that's around the building. So very, I guess one of the things which facilities managers do is juggle a whole range of different priorities, and on a risk basis, decide what's going to come front of mind and what's going to come first. And so, to a point that Liam made and many others before him, that looking at this from a risk perspective is super important. So I'll just let you know that, the majority of our members, and I draw a lot of the information which I speak about from our members' perspective, doesn't count Class 1 buildings. Not to say it exclusively that's true. We do have members who would be operating in Class 1 environments for things like social housing infrastructure or community housing. But for the majority, we're talking about, the commercial building classes. So I think one of the things that we know is that there's very few monitoring or measurements or readings being gathered, with probably with the exception of temperature, particularly in commercial buildings and other commercial classes of buildings. And so air quality doesn't become a prevalent issue unless it's spoken about. And I think that the way that we change that is by bringing it to people's attention. But it's going to have to be not only the people who have a vested interest, like the facilities managers or the owners or people who might be immune compromised or others. We really need a broader understanding and knowledge of this across all occupants within the built environment. And the other thing is that they probably need to understand more about what the health impact of that means. It's very good to be able to say, okay, well, we know that 800 parts per million of CO2 is probably acceptable, but what does that actually mean in terms of disease transmission and other impacts? One of the things which I was talking with someone earlier, one of the things which we've started to do in our office is we have a small office with 6 people in it, and we have a little ARINA sitting in the corner. You're all familiar with the little CO2 monitor. And so the staff in our office have decided that 23 degrees is the comfort level that they enjoy. And so what we've decided to do, or as a group, is that every time the number goes over 800 or over 23 degrees, they go out and tell the concierge the air's no good. And so by bringing that awareness to the concierge, hopefully that's going to take this down the path somewhere where it probably wouldn't have gone if people didn't start, I guess, in a way, sort of becoming serial pests of the air quality that's in our little office space. Okay, just some of the key considerations which I got out of the report is they're listed all up there. I guess the key thing here is that what's being measured, there's probably a whole lot of stuff that's being measured in the background. Is there any of it being analysed? Perhaps, but you couldn't guarantee that by any stretch. One of the things which I just mentioned is when we're doing measurement and when we're trying to understand how do we better understand air quality, we need to look at what is meaningful reporting for different stakeholders. I think it becomes different for a facilities manager than it might come to a occupational hygienist who might, or touching on any other professions which might be utilising space. Broader public awareness is missing, and I thought that the pandemic would act as a catalyst to this more broadly. I think in some respects, people have shied away from conversations about clean air on the basis of some sort of filling up in a fetal position based on every time you talk about sort of transmission of diseases or the pandemic. And I think that's particularly prevalent in Victoria, more so than other states, but it is certainly happening in other states. The other thing is undertaking interventions, and that depends on the intervention as to whether or not we're going to be looking at needing training for people to be able to put interventions in place around improving air. And then obviously the one which is always on everybody's lips is the cost of what this means, and how do you build a business case that looks at perhaps not only the cost versus the financial benefit, but to previous speakers' points around what are the social benefits and opportunities of measuring those in a meaningful way to put together a business case. Just looking there, Jason mentioned it earlier, any changes in a built environment are probably going to involve facilities management professional. We know that certainly when it comes to delivering outcomes, that FMs are in the top 10. Depending on where they sit on that list will vary depending on what we're talking about. It might be different for energy efficiency as it is for air quality or so forth, but they're certainly in that top 10. And really it's about, how do you engage a facilities manager in a way which is utilising their skills as a negotiator or a custodian of a space and being able to be an influencer and change person. I mentioned about the issue becoming front of mind, but this is about how do we get occupants to not only expect, but verbalise that expectation or document that expectation in some way which is meaningful. If we had a safe work regulation which said that every office building needs to be X, Y, and Z in terms of its air quality, all of a sudden employers would realise that that was an obligation, and then that would then firm up how are we going to lease office space that is meeting that requirement, because we now know that there is a firm regulation set down, and so it's about how do you use that demand structure to bring this issue forward. The one which I'm always buoyed by is the fact that the take-up over the more recent years, and you've got someone talking about neighbours later in the week, but neighbours IEQ has had significant take-up over the last 3 to 5 years, more so than some of the other tools, and so that means that it is starting to grow some traction across our built environment. So just looking at some of the challenges, because there was a number of challenges highlighted through the report. Positioning of the issue, I think, is one which is always complex. Who do we need to grow the understanding of this issue to make sure that it takes, it is able to progress? Are we talking about, in the case of the built environment, are we talking about the building owner? Are we talking about occupants? Are we talking about the facilities management professional? I think we're probably talking about all of those different groups. But how do we bring that common understanding and common knowledge to each of those groups so that they are aware of what impact they're having in, I guess, the value chain? I think there's always going to be, certainly in our members' minds, that tension between energy efficiency, which equals cost, and air quality, and whether or not there are mechanisms for being able to achieve both at the same time. And I know that Jason did some research a number of years ago which demonstrated there was interventions which could be made that delivered improvement in both of those. And so that leads on, I guess, the drivers for change, and where they're going to sit and what are they going to be. The occupancy limitations piece, I just put that up there because I think in a number of other areas where there's been highlight of concern about people's health and safety, an example might be in a licensed establishment. We regulate the number of people who can go into a nightclub for a whole range of reasons, and so there's no necessarily any limit on how many people you might stuff into an office building, depending on what the, what the floor plate looks like and so on and so forth. And so why is it that we don't have regulations around some of those things? Is that one possible intervention which might simplify some of this by understanding how many people make reasonable quality air and how many additional people then turn that into poor quality air, and putting some simple regulation around that. And then the last piece, which we all know, is that this is, extremely complex area. We're talking about 10 building types and, as many different occupant types, I would think. But when we talk about building classes, it's not only those 10. I mean, every building is, designed and constructed pretty much individually. And so interventions are going to be have to be able to deliver it in that way. But don't worry, it's not all bad news. Some opportunities. I think one of the most amazing pieces of opportunity we have is the use of technology. The cost of technology is coming down, and the ability to be able to monitor and even use technology to manage things is becoming more and more affordable, but also more and more reliable in many respects. Utilising public policy interventions is one thing which I think provides a good opportunity without, until we get to a place where somebody's prepared to regulate. And I'll give you an example. There's a government that has nominated that they will only use accommodation which is neighbours IEQ rated. And so, neighbours energy rated. And so all of a sudden now there's hotels out there getting energy rated who have never thought about getting energy rated previously. So very light touch public policy, doesn't require, 2 houses of parliament to pass it. But the opportunity there is to bring a consciousness of those things through simple public policy interventions. The improvements in equipment and the use of market mechanisms, I think two pieces there. You know, we know the energy efficiency and net zero conversation is pushing more and more buildings to full electrification. That's an opportunity because it means that there's going to be a lot of equipment swapped out over the next, decade and a half. And so if we're electrifying equipment, we're swapping from a current technology to a new technology. When we do that, that provides us with an opportunity to do interventions which might improve air quality at the same time, or at least give us the ability to manage and monitor it differently. And that use of market mechanisms piece, I bang on about all the time. I look at Bronwyn when I say that, but I think there's an opportunity to create a race to the top for building owners, just as the same as what was done with the energy efficiency conversation. So just in summary, the three things which we're on about is getting a minimal operational standard, simple, clear, transparent methodology which everybody understands and can push forward. An extension of a common rating system for all buildings, so moving beyond commercial buildings to, common across all buildings, and then mandating their disclosure over a period of time so that everybody understands what good air looks like, making the invisible visible, right? What good air is. And so, my dream would be one day to be able to go to the local Westfield shopping centre and understand that, the air quality is of sufficient quality for me to want to go inside, as opposed to, the vicinity shopping centre where it's not, or vice versa. I put the caveat there, vice versa. That's mine. Thanks.
Well, we might start with if anybody has questions for either Liam or Nick. We'll go with you first, and then Bob.
Sorry.
I'm going to bring the
Down here.
down here. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, I just couldn't see your hand. Thank you.
Hi, Liam. Thank you. That was a great presentation. About 20 years ago, I got involved with Southern Cross Station with the air quality in there. I was a passenger and got a new job at Melbourne Council, caught the train, got off at Southern Cross Station, and I nearly died. And I've done a lot of work in air quality prior to that. I thought, why haven't people complained about this? So I walked around and talked to the workers. Yeah, we complain. Nobody's doing it. There's no standards. They reckon they're testing the air, which they were supposed to do under the contract. I read the contract, and but they hadn't been testing for diesel because there's no indoor standard for diesel exhaust. And I thought, well, this is a bit weird. So I wrote to Southern Cross Station, what are you doing about this? Yeah, we're working on it. Kept writing to them, and they eventually told me not to write to them anymore. None of your business. I thought, okay. So then I got a friend of mine from the United States came over, an environmental scientist, and we took an air quality monitor there, put it in a bag, and walked around the station for 3 hours before we got quite sick. And the levels there were double what they were outside. They were over almost about 30 micrograms per cubic meter for PM 2.5. And so I spoke to the union guys there and said, so what are you doing? Well, we've tried to talk to people. They're not interested. Nobody wants to do anything about this. So 20 years later, the ABC rang me and said, we're going to do a story on Southern Cross Station. Oh, really? Okay. So they wrote a really good newspaper. Did you read it? Newspaper article about Southern Cross Station. Yeah, I bet. And they wrote a couple of articles about it. And they're trying to get the levels sorted in there because they have idling diesel trains. As you know, there's no safe exposure to diesel exhaust. So the EPA were never involved with Southern Cross Station because it was an indoor work environment. So I went to the EPA and they said, well, I'm sorry, but nothing we can do here. So what's happening with Southern Cross Station now? I know they're having monthly meetings, and they were trying to get me involved as well, the union, but they didn't want me there apparently. So they're having monthly meetings, and the EPA are now involved, and it's still bad. I've had people ring me and say, I went to Southern Cross Station yesterday and I nearly died. I'm thinking, so what is happening at Southern Cross Station? Thank you.
So, I probably don't want to get into too much detail at Southern Cross, but let me talk about it in broad concept, because I think what you touched on is like very relevant. Why actually, setting aside EPA, I'm not an expert in that area, but every public building is a workplace, and every duty holder, person running it, has a duty not just to those who work there, but to those who come into it. So if you're managing a facility, yes, you have obligations to consult with workers and understand and control risks related to them, but equally, if you're a passenger travelling through the station, they've equally got an obligation to you. And clearly, Southern Cross has not been meeting its most basic duty to ensure the health and safety of workers and others in relation to air. I would say, I think there are some challenges, and one of the reasons why our movement pushed so hard to have so many of those 700 workplace exposure limits reviewed, because they were not protective. Whether it's diesel, nitrogen dioxide, were not protective. And we are now on the eve of those new standards being introduced, and there's still fights over the last few of them. I know I've spoken to people in this room about the sort of health evidence about it, but we are very hopeful that come December next year, we'll have new lower standards that will be legally enforceable, so you cannot exceed them. I think there's some debate about whether Southern Cross was potentially in breach in relation to different contaminants at different times. But I feel confident, not having seen the data, but anecdotally speaking to people, that the new levels they would absolutely be exceeding, and they need to take action to ensure they're not exposing workers or the travelling public to them. Because in some cases, you're talking about significant impacts to health. And if this is your workplace, so set aside whether you're travelling through this on the way to your office or way out to Melbourne Council, or this is where you are spending 8 hours a day every day, a significant impact on your health. And so I, without getting into what's next, I do feel like when I spoke about the lowering of those workplace exposure limits, it was very much to start to capture some of those workplaces that were not necessarily, doing the right thing there. But
I think right to say about diesel standard.
which we have a new one now. That's not true. There is a standard for diesel particulate. There was a lot of fighting about how we measure it and what gets measured, but there is a standard. Everything that happens in a workplace, there is a standard for. So if your workplace is outdoors, same applies.
Standard for diesel.
Yes.
And elemental carbon.
Yes.
That they're using.
Yep.
It's going to be introduced next year.
December.
Yeah. So they've actually done testing at Southern Cross Station already, and the union guys said and stuff. And said, look, this is what we've had tested. And some of the levels were zero. And I can't really,
Yep.
like, so again, who knows what's going on there.
Let's have a chat after. I'm sure we can
We might move to
spar together.
the last question. Thank you. And then we'll go to Heike.
Thank you, Bob Sharon. This is directed at Nick. I know you're a strong advocate of the market leading as it has done so well with Neighbours. And I guess one of the main drivers there was an economic driver. And Neighbours has proven beyond doubt that leveraging excuse the pun, sustainable economics, we've been able to enhance the environment, reduce energy, and improve Neighbours ratings in the environment from that perspective. However, now in terms of indoor air quality, it's a much harder thing to quantify the economics, although there is more data now available. But how do we communicate with people to use that economic argument to build the market acceptance to say, hey, you can't afford not to do this. You can't afford not to be monitoring your indoor air quality and improving it. What's your response to that, Nick?
Yeah, so I think there's different ways to look at it. I think if we had some sort of structure which said 3 stars air quality on a building means that you're going to stay alive, 5-star means you're probably going to be healthier, and 1-star means you probably don't want to go inside. All of a sudden, and that rating was mandated, at least at a tenant level, for instance, say in an office building, I reckon the economics would stack up because you'd lose tenants. you'd lose occupants. And even at a shopping centre level, the Westfield level, if there was a public campaign that said 3 stars is barely doable, 5 stars is great, 1 star is no good, and you rolled up to your local shopping centre and it was consistently at 3, you would either find another shopping centre or you would, minimise the time that you're exposed to it by being in there. And then that has an economic dividend because patronage goes down. So I think there is other ways to look at it, but, we've got to get the standard in place to start with.
Thank you.
Very quick question for Liam. So you showed what you are working on, and for 2006 you put on biological hazards. When will you include mold, microbes? There's hundreds of workers' comp cases currently in court. Why do we always have this lag between legislation and litigation? Why do we need to win or lose hundreds of cases where people really, really sick before we start even recognizing what the contaminant is and then regulating it?
So just so I'm very clear, I would have had a practice in long ago. In fact, if we think globally, the union movement argued for a biological hazards convention, an ILO instrument in the 1980s, and it's been resisted by employers. So I don't run safe work. I don't determine what we're going to, I'm not a work health and safety minister. They're the ones that determine our work program. We have been advocating for stronger regulations on biological hazards. It is clearly a gap. It was most evident during COVID. And actually, the Work Health and Safety Act envisages having regulations on biological hazards. It's the only, type of hazard that isn't regulated like other hazards. So we would absolutely say we should. There is a public consultation, I believe, that is just closed on the biological hazards code of practice. So, we'll be hoping to push it as broad as possible. And now that we've got a sort of international convention that we hope Australia will ratify, this will be another hook in which we say it needs to be as broad as you described, but also it needs to be regulated.
Pippa Geo from CSIRO. The pandemic was, the silver lining of the pandemic was the work from home. However, one of the closed door conversations or the conversations that are being had about work from home, air quality, the obligation that the workplace has to provide a safe environment. I get my work from home HSE checklist and it includes everything other than air quality. So what are the, it's a Pandora's box, I assume, but what are the early conversations?
Yeah. So, obviously work from home and the employer duty is a challenging one because the duty arises from your ability to actually impact the premises. And so, largely work from home checklists are being driven by what is the employer providing you in terms of that. But I think greater awareness around what are the hazards that are existing in your home is something we do need to do more on. I would probably caution against saying that the employer has a responsibility necessarily to start taking action in your home around ventilation, but we should be making it creating much more awareness around risks around transmission at homes as well.
Just invite the questioners to tell us your name and where you're from. So.
Thanks, Jason. Ben Gill. I'm the CEO of Mason Shield in Adelaide. Jen, thank you very much. Liam, you deal with hundreds of employers across Australia. Nicholas, you've got hundreds of members, but they then have hundreds of customers who are landlords and asset managers throughout Australia. In the engineering space, Simon, your clients are building and refurbing buildings all the time. Can you give us a sense, and perhaps in their most candid moments, what do engineers, what to designers, what to landlords particularly, because it's them who's going to pay the bill, what are they communicating to you in their most candid moments?
Okay, I'll go first.
Employers aren't generally that candid with me. So I'm very interested in
shockingly, at a very basic level, what pandemic? It's gone. Past. Move on. That's probably the most standard that's been there. Why do I need a pandemic mode? So yeah, if that's not a straight enough answer, there you go. Over to you.
Yeah, look, I think our members are experiencing a whole range of frustration from clients that were trying to get commercial spaces reoccupied, are trying to, depending on what we're talking about, our members who are working in hospitals, a whole range of other different challenges, schools, a different set of challenges, and so I think I think there are different different frustrations and different challenges for our members, depending on what type of building they're in, and whether they're working for sort of a remote owner or somebody who's got a vested interest in it, an owner operator like a university or something like that. So I think there's many different conversations being had, but I think ultimately it's about how do you meet end user expectation better post-pandemic than you were beforehand? And is there any interventions which are simple to try and achieve that? That's probably...
I think I won't talk to employers being candid because, like I said, they're not particularly candid with me, but I will talk about some observations that I've had over the last few years in terms of, I think, employers' good intentions wanting to control risks in their workplace. I think we're really good at controlling the risks that we can see and we can touch. We're pretty good, notwithstanding 200 people killed every year, at controlling the sort of physical hazards in the workplace. Things that a single event is going to cause harm or death. We're not too bad on that, and regulators are pretty good at eventually catching up with you if you're not. What we're not great at is the things that are chronic, prolonged exposures, can't see and you can't touch. Put poor air right at the top of that, but I also put mental health right up there, where work factors are constantly at play. And so I actually think we need to really lift employer capacity or duty holder capacity in terms of thinking about those sorts of risks, because they're not the sort of things that people generally associate with health and safety. Yet health and safety provides a great framework for thinking about these things, doing it in consultation, trying to understand how dynamic hazards and risks can be assessed. So I suppose that's my biggest frustration, is that we spend a lot of time training workers who get to exercise rights about how they exercise their rights. We spend very little time training employers what their obligations are. And I think that's the biggest. That's not me pointing a finger and saying, oh, you're not doing your job, but your example on Southern Cross is a classic one of course, like you have a duty. But I don't think it's thought about that way nearly enough.
Okay, further questions, Ted? Yeah, sure. I haven't acknowledged that Geoff, always larger than life, but actually larger than life right now. And Geoff is joining us by Zoom, and hopefully, if you speak, Geoff, we can hear.
I'm certainly here, Jason.
Well, I don't think he heard the question, because I don't think Ted had his mic on.
Geoff, Simon was asked what are the people he's dealing with secretly talking about in regard to air quality, and he gave a two-word answer, what pandemic, which was very telling. What are your clients saying?
I don't know. Can you hear us, Geoff?
Yes, I can. Was that the question directed at me?
Yes. Did you hear the question?
Yeah, I did.
You did. Okay. Yeah, go, Geoff.
So I think that there's a very variable reaction to this. One extreme is for people to just disavow the whole idea of a pandemic because it's been so traumatic for people. The other approach has been to look at the impacts of the pandemic, particularly on things like sick leave. Liam showed a graph which basically illustrates the problem that we now have higher levels of sick leave than we did before the emergency phase of the pandemic. And for people to react to that. So there are people who are concerned about the impact of the post-emergency phase on their operation, and they are making attempts to fix this up. I mean, most of our clients are universities. Most of them have mechanically ventilated spaces, and there is quite a bit of concern across the university sector about ensuring that spaces are as safe as they can be. Not many of our clients have said what pandemic, but clearly a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about the pandemic and saying the word COVID and telling people how they're reacting to this.
Thanks, Geoff. There's no further questions just yet. I might kick things off with, in the State of Indoor Air report, as I mentioned earlier, that if you look through all the different classes of buildings, you see that there's quite a lot of different activities and different usages in there. So, for example, public building contains schools as well as libraries and all sorts of other public spaces. So the question, I guess, particularly to Simon and Geoff, is to what extent do we design our ventilation systems, or say for a given building, for the different types of activities and different zones, different occupancies within that building?
Shall I go first, Geoff?
Sure. Go ahead, Simon.
Wow, that's a heck of a question, because it's something I've spent 40 years of my life doing. Every building you design, I think as you said, every building is a prototype. So the first thing we have to do when it comes to actually physically designing a ventilation system for a building, if it's the ventilation system we're dealing with at that time, is understand the functionality, what's going on in the space. Now, certain spaces, very, very easy to define. A meeting room, easy. It's got a set number of people, it's got a set number of chairs, that's your maximum design condition. A place like this, which is a hotel function space, you know, they could be holding a wedding reception one day, conference the next. The design for this type of space, really hard to achieve. Now, you may have noticed when you all came in, the doors have been open, the windows have been open during the lunch break, and it was quite cool in here. We shut the doors, everybody came back in, and because the air conditioning system had sensed that the room was cold, it had gone into heating mode. So the moment we closed the door, it got really, really hot. It's now getting itself back under control again. But the design and the way we design those spaces has to take into account an awful lot more than just indoor air quality. But that's a very important part of it. And having a one-size-fits-all solution is a massive challenge.
So just building on the example of the meeting rooms. So meeting rooms obviously different to the open office space that they might be adjacent to. You do treat those differently to the open office space, or do you just? Yeah.
Quite often, the meeting room is fed from the same ventilation system that feeds the office. It may have a VAV box or something like that to trim the amount of air that's being delivered to the space based on the thermal load within the space. Very, very unusual to have meeting rooms that have got separate outside air supplies, supplementary air as we would normally call it, but it's very unusual. Maybe in your top grade offices you'll have supplementary air to meeting rooms, but your general office space, no, the meeting room is just an offshoot. Really, it's just a part of the office with four walls around it. And for the FM guys managing that and managing the air quality in that is next to impossible because it's not measured and it's not controlled. So you've got a lot of challenges in this regard.
Geoff,
I have to say that that's not my experience with meeting rooms that we've designed, at least. And we've been pulled up on this by people like the planning staff at the City of Melbourne, who have insisted on 2 occasions that we bring in outside air to meeting rooms in different buildings in the city of Melbourne. So I think that look, I personally am not that worried about mechanically ventilated spaces anymore. I know that they're not perfect. I know that a lot of them have faults, and I know that the standard isn't as good as it could be. What I have to say is that I'm still extremely concerned about Class 9 buildings that are not mechanically ventilated, that are naturally ventilated, because often these buildings have high occupancy, long duration of interaction, and the ventilation in some of them is absolutely appalling. So the typical situation in schools, which is the focus of my research at the moment, is that we have virtually nil ventilation with extremely poor temperature control. Really, I think most of the functions that are contained in Class 9B buildings, including schools, should be compulsorily mechanically ventilated. I just don't think there's any way out of that. Unfortunately, the National Construction Code, of course, doesn't require mechanical ventilation for schools, nor does it require it for offices. But nobody these days seems to think of constructing an office building without providing mechanical ventilation, in fact, a complete HVAC system. So, as I said, I'm not that worried at mechanical systems. If we go into shopping centres, Westfield was mentioned, when we measure those, we generally find that the ventilation is quite good. The airline terminals, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, the air quality is all pretty good. It's not excellent, but it's not bad. But if we go into a local school, we'll find the air quality being pretty terrible. And the other Class 9C buildings, aged care, if we go into common spaces in residential aged care facilities, we also find that air quality is very poor. So if we were trying to triage our response, which I think we have to because it's such an enormous problem, then the two areas that I would suggest we concentrate on are schools and aged care, simply because they're the most obvious sites of infection for people who are vulnerable for different reasons. Anyway, thanks for having me online, by the way. Thank you very much to the organisers, and hello to everyone.
I won't let you ask it yet, Geoff. Is there a role for natural ventilation? Oh, sorry.
I could just exactly that. If I could just pick up on what Geoff was saying there. Again, as a building designer, if I have a brief, and a lot of this does come down to the brief as well. But if I'm given a brief where the building I'm working on is naturally ventilated, then the first thing that tells me is that ventilation isn't a priority in this building. So you get on with concentrating on everything else. So I definitely agree. If we're talking about mandated standards, if we're talking about continual control of indoor air quality, then quite literally natural ventilation goes out the window. You have to draw a line under it and say, no, we mechanically ventilate schools, or we mechanically ventilate aged care. We don't have natural ventilation in those spaces.
Is there a role anywhere for natural ventilation?
Yes, where you're not worried about indoor air quality.
or where you have low occupancy. I think, for housing, we can get a good environment with natural ventilation. I'm not terribly concerned about that. In residence rooms of residential aged care facilities, we can get a reasonable quality of indoor air with natural ventilation. It's really the situations where we have high concentrations of people over long periods of time that this all breaks down, because the natural ventilation rules in the NCC are purely in relation to the floor area of the building. So somebody sitting in a naturally ventilated 10 square metre office has a half square metre of ventilation area, which they can choose to open or shut. A kid in a school assembly, one of 350, might have a 20th of that area available to them, and they won't have the choice to open or close the window. So I think just in terms of priorities, for me, that's the biggest problem is naturally ventilated Class 9 buildings.
But even in those low occupancy situations, Geoff, you've still got the issue of if it's too hot or it's too cold, people shut windows and stop the source of outside air. So you still got to. It still happens only, but within a narrow band.
Yeah, look, Dave, look, Simon. I think that's absolutely true, and I'm not saying that that's a perfect situation. Far from it. People's, I guess, lack of education about air quality and the reason why they should open windows is poor. We've got all sorts of problems, but I think at home in Class 1 or Class 2 buildings, we have less problems than we have elsewhere. One exception to that is the foyers of Class 2 buildings, which interestingly, this is apartment buildings. Interestingly, 30 years ago, and I'm not quite sure about the story here yet, but 30 years ago, under the various state regulations, they were required to be ventilated. And now it seems under the National Construction Code, most people don't ventilate those common spaces. So here's a case where there is something of an anomaly in the National Construction Code. And, it's another gap to plug. But in terms of the level of risk, I'm guessing that is much less socially significant than, for instance, a school building where, as most people in the room will have realised, their children are very effective vectors for whatever is going around at school, and will bring it home and infect everyone. So, I think schools are an obvious case where if we did better, we would have flow-on effects to the rest of society, which would be strongly beneficial.
So can I just pick up on something Simon said about natural ventilation relying on people opening and shutting windows, but in some respects, mechanical ventilation is not foolproof either because people block vents and bring their own space heater in under their desk. I'm just saying.
Just on your suggestion for schools and aged care, I think you also need to involve childcare centres. Most childcare centres are built on main roads, and the thing I've done a lot of work with childcare centres, particularly with air quality, and what they do is when children go outside to play, they leave all the doors open because children have to have access to inside and out. So all the dirty air, which most childcare centres are exposed to because they're on main roads, goes inside the building. The children go inside and they shut the doors. So that filthy air is stuck inside the building. So you've got to add childcare centres to this because there's a lot of childcare centres around that just aren't being looked after as far as air quality goes.
Oh, look, I absolutely agree. A childcare centre is classified the same way as a school, so it's a Class 9B building, and so most of them are naturally ventilated. And I think your comment about them being often sited on main roads and therefore vulnerable to all the pollution that's associated with roads is absolutely correct. This is a town planning failure of the first order to allow childcare centres to be built on main roads. There's some memory of this with primary schools and lead and petrol, where most primary schools were taken away from main roads largely because of lead exposure. And so we, generally speaking, don't build primary schools on main roads anymore, although there's nothing aside from that memory to prevent us doing so. But with childcare centres, we often see, for commercial reasons, people building them on main road locations so that people see them. And when they do that, all of the effects that you've just identified are evident. So because childcare centres stress a lot of time spent outside, it wouldn't be a particularly good solution for them to have mechanical ventilation in the centre, simply because so much time is spent outside in whatever environment you have. So I think what we need to do is to stop, through the planning laws, childcare centres being situated on main roads or next to transport corridors.
Lara first, and then we'll go to David.
Lara Kemp from Mycologia. My question is going back to the role of natural ventilation. Do you not think there's a role for natural ventilation existing as a contingency when we have things like climate disasters that will shut down all of the power to a building? And if you only have mechanical ventilation as an option and your building is sitting there sealed up and often wet, does that not create a secondary issue?
Wow. Yes, it does create the issue. And depending on how the building's been briefed and designed, there's probably nothing you can do about it. Because that scenario was never envisaged in the original briefing, the original design for that building. I mean, you get the same thing with, you know, an all-steel building, fully mechanically ventilated. Someone knocks a sprinkler head. Sprinkler water goes through the building. Your worst nightmare, I would think. And they're a devil to put right afterwards, because you've got no way of physically pushing the air through the building.
Look, I think there's, if a building has no power, then probably not a lot of work is going to be going on in the building, and so the first step might be to evacuate the building. I mean, one of the climate disasters we have is bushfires, and one of the advantages of mechanically ventilated buildings is that they can be designed to alleviate the impact of bushfires. One of the things we can say is that with a naturally ventilated building, there's nothing we can do. So it depends on which climate disaster we're talking about. And these are things that we do need to think through and make sure that we have some response. But what I would say is that with bushfire smoke, naturally ventilated buildings are absolutely nowhere.
No, I was just going to say, to your point, I've been on an aircraft where the mechanical ventilation broke down, and it gets pretty unpleasant pretty quickly. But there's nothing you can do about it.
Opening windows on the plane.
Yeah, not an option.
Just on the bushfire thing, and that's really interesting. There is a system that is really good at removing smoke from bushfires. It was actually, I think, invented by the train air conditioning company back in the 1800s. And it deals with bushfires because of the way it actually cools the building. So you provide chilled water to what's called an air washer. So you're passing the air through this curtain of chilled water. And because the air is passing through the curtain of chilled water, it strips out anything like that. That system is still in use in the National Gallery in America. And when they had those horrendous bushfires that came down from Canada, most of the buildings in DC were having real problems with indoor air quality. The one building that didn't have the problem was the National Gallery, and they didn't realise why until they looked back at the actual system. Unfortunately for the National Gallery, they are now removing those systems because they're energy inefficient. which is a real shame. But there is technology, both old and new, that can deal with things like bushfire smoke. I mean, the problem with bushfire smoke, as the way we deal with it now currently, is it's done by what's called activated carbon filtration. So when you get the bushfire alert, a couple of the hospitals we work with, they've got things that they can insert into the air handling units, sections they can insert into the air handler to drop carbon filtration in there. You can't keep it in there permanently because activated carbon degrades after roughly 4 to 6 months. So even if you didn't have a bushfire, you'd be changing these filters every 4 months or so, just in case you were going to get one. So there are lots of different technologies out there, and I think one of the issues that we're going to have certainly in Australia, if we're going to be facing more and more bushfires, is maybe consider going back to the train air washing system. Okay, slightly more energy inefficient, but it's a great system. So it's just understanding the technologies that are actually there and actually available. You know, bring back the 1890s. Yeah. It's the systems are there.
Go ahead.
Hi, David Chin from Northern Territory Government again. Just a question about low-hanging fruit. Currently, we're talking about the issues, but in terms of providing indoor air quality as a prescriptive requirements, there is some low-hanging fruit available now that we may be able to push, such as, for example, the issue of natural running buildings and naturally ventilated open doors and windows. I feel that maybe it should be climate zone related, because we don't open our windows up and down when it's hot. And if you've got a recirculating air conditioning like a split system or that, there's no ventilation going in whatsoever. So for our schools, we don't have that. I think New South Wales are heading down that path, splits, which I start shaking my head, because once you have the aircon, there's no ventilation. The other one is amenity. Now, Australian 1668 Part 2 talk about comfort, as you said, Simon, but it doesn't address amenity to its full issue at all. And that's the sort of areas I'm thinking maybe we should start looking about that. See where we can get some small inroads into how we can start improving. We've implemented some things in the Northern Territory off our own back, but I'm very excited about where we're moving as a country as a whole, now that we're sitting together here now.
I definitely agree. I mean, I think targeting 1 or 2 of the indoor air quality measures at the start would be a really good way to do. If we've got a limited target we're aiming for, we can probably achieve something really good. If we keep the target too broad, there are too many things to consider, and it'll just muddy the waters and confuse it all a bit. Little steps maybe, but I agree. Pick a couple of things and really go after them and see where that leads us. Would be the way I'd like to do it, certainly from a design perspective as well.
Could I just add that I don't think AS 1668 Part 2 is anything like a perfect standard. Far from it. However, it's an existing standard which gives a decent result if it's properly implemented by people like Simon. So Simon's AS 1668 Part 2 compliance system would be a good one, I hope, Simon. And so I think, we shouldn't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. If we have a school which has an AS 1668 Part 2 mechanical ventilation system, we at least know that that has got a baseline amount of fresh air going into the school, and that comfort has at least been considered. May not be perfect, but it's certainly better than the situation that's been described where we have split systems overlaid on a naturally ventilated building, where almost inevitably the windows get shut, the temperature and comfort becomes the primary goal of running the air conditioning system internally, split systems, and ventilation is nowhere. So I think just all I'm saying is we've got existing systems, as Simon says, there's systems out there. We've got existing technology. We've got people who know how to install a 1668 Part 2 compliant system. All of those things are there now. Perhaps we should maybe just focus on extending the number of buildings that are AS 1662 compliant. And as we do that, we might think about the standard itself, and we might think about the quality standards that we're setting over time. But let's not delay doing something for the sake of trying to make 1668 Part 2 perfect.
We've got Claire and then Ted and then Robin.
Thanks. Hi, Claire Burt here, Director of Litmus Laboratories and Associate Director of the area of IAQ Special Technical Group. Question for you. Look, it's just been amazing and what a wonderful time. Thank you to everybody, first and foremost, for organising this and participating. But we're talking this morning, we've got this wonderful document here that started to look to being able to get the standards, Nick, that I know you've been calling for a while. Simon's just described the situation of putting a carbon filter into a mechanical system. I'm very aware and worked alongside some of the technologies that started to decouple CO2 thresholds from other risks in buildings, because even simply, if we look at the filter next to me, that's decoupling the infection risk from the CO2 level. As we start to see emerging technologies being employed and being deployed in our buildings, I always think of, if I'm standing there and I'm having a glass of water, I know when I drink that glass of water I'm not going to get sick. I'm not standing there with a pH strip or a little stick that I'm going to put in there to see if that's safe, because I'm relying on the fact that the standards put in place at the wastewater treatment plant to guarantee I have safe water coming through that tap. Yes, we need air quality monitors. Yes, we need air quality standards. And my question for you is, how can we get to the point where it's like the water coming out of our tap, where our buildings and our systems are managed in such a way and standardised in such a way that we no longer have to think about it, and do you think that's the target?
I think it's probably the wrong analogy. The air coming out of the grill is like the water coming out of your tap. Problem is, we all drink from the same trough, and that's the issue. It's not like we have our own individual air supply that we're all sipping from, and therefore we know the quality of that air that's been given to us. The issue is the fact that we're all in the same trough, all drinking the same water, if you like, and therefore we've got to find a way of trying to keep that trough as clean as possible. And that's really where what we're talking about here.
I mean, I think that's a really is the correct analogy. But I think just going back to what the questioner just said, it is, I think, true that the more we can leave these sort of things to the building and the less effort individuals have to put into this, the better the situation will be. It's I think unrealistic, and at least we've found this in the school sector, unrealistic to have everyone open their windows and be conscious of air quality. There are some schools that manage this because the principal is highly motivated and she motivates or he motivates the rest of the school to fall in line. But I don't think that's going to work in every situation. So I think essentially these systems have to be automatic. And we found with buildings that, for instance, attempt to reduce energy consumption, that complex ventilation systems that require operator intervention actually don't really work. So that's just a perspective. We just don't, in public buildings, people just don't feel that they have the agency to intervene in a ventilation system, and I just think we have to accept the fact that that's the case.
Liam wants to make a comment and then Ted.
I'm not going to try and bridge the two analogies. Fun. But I want to maybe give you a third one, which is that this was a workplace and Jason instructed Ted to come out here and start welding in front of us, and it generated emissions. We would all have an expectation that the employer understood the risks that we were all being exposed to. I'd say it's equally the case that if it's an activity that's being undertaken that requires 50 people to be in a room, we can reasonably expect what's going to happen. And so I actually think the gap to close is not that significant. We just need to use the frameworks we've got. It's not the same as you can never exceed this when it comes to an airborne contaminant. It's going to have to be different when it comes to rebreathed air. But we should be able to have some markers that workers should be able to objectively say, reasonable to think that in this workplace, you should be taking the following reasonably practicable controls to start to improve indoor air quality. So, whether it's water, a trough, whatever, I think it's about having some objective markers out there that workers can reasonably expect to be undertaken in their workplace. And to your point, the point that was made about agency, I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about. Like, fundamentally, our movement is about giving workers agency so they can exercise exactly what I said at the start, those rights that they've got to ensure that their workplace is safe and healthy.
I won't ask Ted the weld, but equally dangerous. I might ask you to ask a question.
To weld, including Geoff.
High risk work life.
I have a slightly more benevolent view about natural ventilation than Geoff does, particularly in apartment buildings and in residential buildings. And I also think there's a role in schools. But aside from that, let's just talk momentarily about bushfires and agency. And a question for Liam. The people most exposed are firefighters. And traditionally, we've had the dual system of professional firefighters and volunteer firefighters. What's the mandated protection for firefighters?
In terms of bushfire protection?
Yeah, in terms of air.
Well, I mean, it's funny, I was on the phone with the United Firefighters Union on the way here, and we're talking about just the high levels of atmospheric testing that happen at fire scenes. And yeah, full respiratory protection at a domestic fire, and indeed, if you're out on a fire line, you would expect some pretty strong respiratory protection.
And that applies to volunteers as well.
Well, I mean, if you're a volunteer, you're owed a duty by your employer. That doesn't change. A volunteer firefighter that's being asked to do anything by anybody has the same rights to a healthy and safe workplace as a paid firefighter does.
So the first public response to bushfires is evacuate while you can. And that's probably the best response. But there remains, in my view, a role for natural ventilation, even in those circumstances.
Robin, might be the last question we have time for.
Yeah, I think the discussion around the natural disasters and the resilience there is really interesting. As part of the response to their inquiry, the federal government inquiry on natural disasters, there was a call for safe indoor havens, and I think what hasn't come up in the conversation yet is like our civil defence, places where we vote, town halls, places where people will be in high concentrations if there is a flood, fire, etc. What are the standards there, and what could be done for these spaces to be especially resilient?
From a ventilation perspective, they will fall into AS 1668 Part 2. So how many people are in the space? What's the occupancy density? How long are they going to be there for? Just that's actually basic. Number one. Number two then is, okay, what's coming in from outside? What am I trying to control? What am I trying to eliminate? What am I trying to mitigate? So, if someone said to me, let's design a bushfire place of last resort, in that instance, I probably would seriously consider using an air washer. I wouldn't use it to control temperature. but I'd have something there that it was dragging the outside air in, it was flooding it through the air washer, and that air would get then into the space. It'd get pretty humid and people would complain a bit, but they wouldn't have the volatiles and the soot contamination that tends to go with those if you're in an extreme event like that. So again, what's your brief? What are we trying to design to? How long we're trying to control it for? And once you understand those things, you can then begin to come up with your one-off prototype.
But just in response to your trough that we're all drinking from, you can always be flooding the trough awfully, and all of a sudden it becomes less of an issue.
That is the point, yes. You know, so you're flooding the trough is the air change rate,
Yeah,
the water change rate.
exactly.
And it's understanding what are the what's the water quality like?
Mm-hmm.
What do we want to achieve?
Yeah.
That was what I meant with the analogy, really.
Yeah, no, it was a good analogy.
I'm very disappointed. I have a very long list of questions that Wendy and I have come up with, but I didn't get them. But that's fantastic because it means we've had a great panel discussion with awesome questions from the audience. Just in the last couple of minutes before we go, I might ask you each for a brief statement on the following question. What do you think is the first next step that we could do to accelerate change for the better indoor air quality?
I think pick a few key or 2 or 3 key targets and try and get those through in legislation, or at least in a standard that can pin people to something when they don't go under them. Because it's great to have guidance, it's great to have things that we do best practice, but to actually have some hard, fast standard that has to be met. I mean, in AS 1668 there are already standards for air quality, but it's in the guidance section, it's not in the mandatory section. So, you know, got that moved and get some of the numbers changed, and 1668 actually becomes a really good tool for indoor air quality. So that's my view.
Yeah, for me it's a common measurement, a common, simple, consistent, reliable measurement of what air quality is inside a building.
Well, as I said, we're about to kick off the Code of Practice for Managing Work Environment Facilities. I think the ability to translate this new level of knowledge that we've got around these standards into that code and thinking about from a risk perspective, so thinking about facilities like we talked about, education, aged care, and being the places where you need to be a bit more conscious of this, I think that would be a really good first step towards properly regulating it.
Geoff, last word?
Yeah, look, I think we need to deal with the issues around Class 9C and 9B buildings, which the majority of which are naturally ventilated now, and that's just inappropriate. I think it was Ted was saying that I was underestimating the capability of natural ventilation, and I think I made a distinction that Class 1 and 2 buildings, I just don't think we need to mechanically ventilate them. Natural ventilation's fine. I just think in particular Class 9C and 9B, natural ventilation isn't fine. The National Construction Code should require that they be mechanically ventilated to 1668 Part 2.
Okay.
Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks, panel. Let's thank our panel. Great discussion. I believe we're going to show a short video, which is a precursor to the discussion at 5 p.m. At 5 p.m. we won't have video screens, so we're going to show it now. And that's all that's holding you between and coffee. Thanks again.
Today, we are in a novel place for healthy indoor air. The right to healthy environment is not an abstract principle.
It is a binding commitment, a framework that unites 3 fundamental rights: the right to education, the right to health, and the right to a clean environment.
Healthy indoor air is not a luxury. It is essential to safeguarding workers' health,
well-being, and productivity.
For too long, indoor air has been the invisible crisis of our time. Indoor air quality is the least visible, yet one of the most consequential determinants of human health. The person who manages your building to have a bigger impact on your health than your doctor.
I sincerely hope that this meeting will serve as a catalyst for action. We can recognize those rare and human rights as the opportunity of beautiful environment. We can't make clean air. Infrastructure is so ubiquitous and so obvious and necessary to our children how we live life. And we can live a healthier, more equitable, and more resilient future. This is an entirely solvable problem. Together we can address the right resources to solve this problem. Then we can ensure that we the right air into the